There is a kind of reckoning that's happening more broadly in American society. Just the evidence of our eyes, just looking at China. We had all these major taco events this year.
Trump always chickens out.
Yeah, so Trump has chickened out now with China 3 times in very conspicuous ways, where the Trump administration has levied huge tariffs, where China has retaliated, has not backed down, has shown some spine, and Trump has been forced to back down. This last one at Busan was the biggest one. We will look back at that moment in 2025 as the moment when weaponized interdependence was no longer a weapon that only the United States had at its disposal. The interdependence part of it became very operational. So yeah, China, by implementing these rare earths export controls, scared the bejesus out of the Trump administration. So we're living in a very different world right now, where you can't shove China around. And I think the hawks realize that a lot of their bellowing and shaking of their fists rings increasingly hollow to their constituents.
Hi, Kaiser.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm well, man. How are you?
I can't complain, all told. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Non-Zero newsletter. This is the Non-Zero Podcast. You're Kaiser Kuo, publisher of the Sinica now newsletter on Substack, but also, importantly, the Sinica Podcast, which I'm a big fan of.
Thank you. Right back at you.
What's that?
Right back at you.
Well, thank you. I mean, there is a rivalry between our podcasts to see who can most frequently use the phrase cognitive empathy.
This is true.
And sadly, we're the only 2 podcasts in the running. I think it would be a better world if there were more, but we're doing our part.
I'm hearing more strategic empathy out there. I am hearing a lot more, security dilemma sensibility, which is a related concept. So yeah, the word is spreading.
Yeah, the idea is just viewing things from understanding how people are viewing things, whether they're enemies, adversaries, allies, is almost always in your interests and often in the interests of the world. So Sinica covers, China pretty broadly, politics, geopolitics, technology, to some extent culture broadly. And what I wanted to talk to you about today is what I think is your belief that, in some sense, is if you consider this a fair way to put it, the China hawks are in retreat. Maybe that's an overly aggressive way to put it. But, as you know, as of a few years ago, China hawkism had become almost a consensus view in the U.S. foreign policy establishment in Washington for reasons we can get into. But you have, for some months now, I think, been sensing a vibe shift, right?
That's right. I mean, the vibe shift, I think, only really reached the point where I could say the China hawks were sort of in eclipse, if not in full retreat, but in eclipse for sure, only a few months ago. But I think by late January, it was pretty clear that there was a vibe shift underway. And it's been pretty visible now if you look at some of the polling that's been done in the months since.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah.
So why don't I want to examine that thesis and figure out in what senses it has happened, in what senses it hasn't happened, how enduring it's likely to be. But maybe first we should revisit the original coalescence of China hawkism as kind of the default view in America. My sense is it started happening during the first Trump administration, and then the Biden administration kind of helped make it a bipartisan thing. But what's your and that its roots certainly go deeper. Further back in time, for sure.
They do.
So how do you trace the development of the China hawk consensus, and what were its main contributing factors?
I think that it was sort of incipient already. That there were certainly some in the immediate years after the Tiananmen incident in '89. They went into remission for a bit. I think George H.W. Bush, he pretty wisely dispatched some of his diplomats, Lawrence Eagleburger and I can't remember who else it was, who he sent almost immediately after Tiananmen to Beijing to make sure that things were okay. And that really paved the way. It made it politically possible for Deng to take on some of the hardline conservatives by '92 and do his now famous Southern tour, where he really kind of doubled down on economic and to some extent even political liberalization in China. And that really made possible, this kind of golden era that we then saw. But
remember that but I just want to make sure we flesh that out a little. So Deng Xiaoping, you're saying if America had taken a more adversarial stance in the wake of Tiananmen, he would have had more trouble with his conservatives domestically. It would have been less able to have more liberal economic policy of economic engagement with the U.S.
That's right. Because after 89, I think a lot of the people, they tend to cluster. The people who were pushing a line of political reform also happened to be the people who were pushing sort of more economic liberalization. And they were in retreat. They were in full retreat. Zhao Ziyang, who had been the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party at the time of the Tiananmen incident, he was removed from power. He was placed under house arrest and spent the rest of his life there. The man who had died to spark the incident itself, Hu Yaobang, he obviously wasn't on the scene anymore. Who was left were mostly people who you would regard more or less as hardliners, Chen Yun, for example. And they put up a good fight with Deng. Deng was, even though he was one who probably ordered the actual military crackdown, he was still very committed to deepening economic reforms at least. And so it made it, politically possible for him to do that.
Okay, and then here come, you said but, and I guess...
So things get really bad by the mid-90s, right? And there are plenty of reasons to be hawkish. As the first Taiwan democratic election scheduled for January of 96 looms, Beijing starts getting pretty belligerent. They start lobbing missiles into the Taiwan Strait. There are, lots of actions that the United States decides they're going to interpose the 2 carrier groups from the 7th Fleet. They go up to the mouth of the strait, and Beijing is forced to sort of back down. So there's not good blood at that point between the United States and China. And it gets worse. You remember the 99 embassy bombing when the Chinese embassy in Belgrade got bombed in early May of 99. Mm-hmm. And then the EP-3 spy plane incident.
To just remind people, so during the U.S., NATO attack on Serbia in the name of...
the Kosovo War.
Of liberating Kosovo or something, we bombed the Chinese embassy. In America, we all assumed it was an accident. That was not the assumption in China. Maybe we'll later revisit the fascinating anecdote you told last time you were on the podcast about how you got caught up in that. We should say you're a little bit of a rock star. Not in a metaphorical sense, maybe in that sense, but you actually are in a rock and roll band. Or people who are watching this on video can see some of the stuff behind you. But you're in China at the time. As part of a band, and I guess I've said so much, you might as well finish this story. But there was this awkward moment, right, where
very awkward one. Yeah, I was really sort of talking out of school. I was the only American in the band, and we were a pretty high profile band at the time. We were asked to go play what was billed to me as a peace concert in Shenzhen, the amazing city across the border from Hong Kong, and I had a live camera swung into my face where they asked me how I felt about this as the only American on the scene. And I said, I think I'm here in the interest of peace between the Kosovars and Serbs, peace between, the Yugoslavs, the Yugoslav alliance and NATO, and between the United States and China, and, these 2 countries I love. After this tragic accident, I said the word accident, and they didn't like that at all. So I was really I felt very much like persona non grata. Nobody was going to give me the time of day. I felt like I'd really put my foot in it. I'd really it was pretty bad. It ended up sort of...
Casting it as not an intentional strike was beyond the pale, kind of.
Yeah, it's demonstrated too much sort of sympathy or empathy for the Americans. And it was just sort of assumed that I'm only saying that because I'm an American. Mm-hmm. And for them, for most people I talked to, and since, the fact that we learned very quickly that was a CIA picked mission, in fact, the only one of the entire campaign, that in the Chinese mind confirmed their theory that it was deliberate. For me, who I've read Legacy of Ashes. I know about bungling by the CIA. I just assumed that was further evidence that it was probably an accident.
Okay. All right. So I interrupted you. So you've got, that was an issue, a bigger issue than Americans realize, probably.
So the point is, like, after this EP-3 spy plane incident in very early April of 2001, so the Bush administration has just come in. There was, when the national security strategy and the national defense strategy came out, all the documents, the force posture, all these things, they really showed, sort of China as the new baddie on the scene. The Hawks were very much in ascendant, but then along came September 11th, and that changed everything. I mean, there was this that followed a period where China just didn't rate as an issue, as a problem. I mean, nobody was talking about China. Except for Chuck Schumer and Lindsey Graham talking about, things like the undervaluation of the renminbi, but that was about it. I mean, there wasn't anything else that really roiled the waters in the U.S.-China relationship across all those years leading up to the Olympics. So, then I think the China hawks were very much in retreat, or they were so distracted that they couldn't be bothered with being hawkish on China. But they were there. And it wasn't really until after the great financial crisis that we start to see it coming up again. And, I think we could spend a lot of time sort of figuring out who is sort of to blame for the downturn in U.S.-China relations. But it certainly, they start to sour pretty badly not long after Obama comes into office. And as you suggested, I mean, it really peaks in the first Trump administration. Things get really, really bad. I think the real nadir was probably in the spring, summer of 2020, that first awful COVID year.
Right.
Things got really, really, truly terrible. And I was pretty despondent during that time.
Yeah. That was when it became clear to me that the Republicans were going to make it a big campaign issue. I don't recall if I had noticed China hawkism creeping up during the Obama administration. I mean, we should say that there was, after China's entry into the WTO, which I guess happened maybe not long after 9/11, but
not long at all.
Not long at all. And so that was the kind of golden era of engagement, the ensuing years. And China, got trade was a much more appealing thing once they had the tariff rates that WTO membership conferred once they faced those rates. I guess the standard American view is that China I didn't comply with the WTO rules or something. I mean, after this, it becomes kind of a he said, she said story, I guess, along a number of dimensions. And I want to get into some other common things you hear about China, some common justifications for China hawkism. But is that your sense? Is that the American view is that China abused its WTO membership in some sense?
Yeah, certainly that was part of it. But there were also, as is always the case, there was always some sort of moral justification for it as well. And, first there was, of course, Tibet. And then in 2009, when there were, large-scale ethnic riots in Urumqi and in other parts of Xinjiang, then the Uyghurs really sort of take center stage. They had been long ignored, as my Uyghur friends would tell me when asked why all the attention went to the Tibetans. Well, the Tibetans are pandas, they would say, and we're camels. We're prickly and ill-tempered and cantankerous. So, and plus, of course, they were Muslim. Right?
Yeah.
Everyone loves the cuddly Buddhists, the high Himalayan, all that stuff. But right. So that was there was that as well. But there were a whole bunch of other reasons too. I think, we shouldn't underrate this South China Sea business, and then of course Taiwan is a perennial issue.
Yeah. Okay. And then how do you see? So you see it starting to happen in the Obama administration. Kind of what happens and what are the factors?
This is the part that people don't really see from the Chinese side, right? They felt extremely threatened, and I was in the thick of it then, by this doctrine of internet freedom. I mean, Bob, if you think back to that time, to 08, 09, 2010, so these are the later years of the so-called color revolutions, and before the stirrings of the Arab Spring. I mean, maybe there were kind of events that kind of qualify as both. There was the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, after Ahmadinejad's very questionable re-election with 97% of the vote. A lot of people took to the streets in the suburbs of northern Tehran, and it was the Green Revolution, right? That was because that was the color associated with I can't remember the name of the candidate who was sort of cheated.
Yeah.
Musavic, I think.
I was going to say Mossadegh, but that's the guy who was deposed in a coup in 53, right?
Right.
It sounds like Moose something, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. My apologies to you, sir. But yeah, we labeled that the YouTube revolution, and then we went on to label many other later Arab Spring uprisings, Moldova that happened before that, as the Twitter revolution. Then, called Tahrir Square, the Facebook revolution, alternately the Google revolution, all these things. We just kind of merrily slapped the name of some American social media product onto all these things. And the idea was, of course, as I've often said, it would have been hard to open any American broadsheet to the op-ed section in those years and not seen this argument being made that freeing the internet was going to bring down authoritarian regimes the world over. We really were hard into that emancipatory narrative about especially social media, but the digital revolution more broadly. And China felt very threatened by that. You have to remember, China's internet, China didn't connect to the internet until 1995. By 99, when the embassy bombing happened, I remember there were less than 1 million people online in China, but that number just kept on doubling every couple of quarters. And by the time of, the Olympics, there were 300,000 or 300 million people or more online.
Wow. The Olympics are in 2008.
Eight. That's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I visited I guess I was there in 2010 maybe. And at that point, things still seemed pretty friendly. The Americans I saw there who, friends had put me in touch with an American journalist or two who lived there, and they said, hey, it's great. You should live here. It's wonderful. And, but that's about the time you see things starting to turn.
Yeah. I started calling it this new truculence on the part of China back then. We started to see just, a real crackdown. We started to see genuine internet censorship back then where it really had been pretty light-handed before. So prior to the Olympics, it's hard for people to remember, but YouTube wasn't blocked, Google wasn't blocked, Facebook wasn't blocked, Twitter wasn't blocked. It was still this nascent, but none of these things, the BBC or Time or CNN, none of these things were blocked. The Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, that would have been blocked, or anything that was sort of openly advocating Taiwan or Tibetan or Xinjiang independence would have been blocked. But only these sort of usual suspects. It was a very different time. But so things started to get, much harder. And of course, there was this kind of element of hubris. There's no denying that China really felt like, hey, the student has surpassed the master. The United States has really bungled its stewardship of the global, economic system. All these problems originate in the United States, and we're having to bail them out now.
2008 housing
Financial
bubble
crisis,
that really intensified that view in China, right? Like
very much, yeah.
The U.S. really doesn't know what it's doing on the global stage. That was a major screw up, and it really was. It was a U.S. screw up with big global implications, and I think that gave China the sense that, like, wait a second, why are they running the show? Right.
That's right. And China really stepped up at the behest, really, of the team that was put together, the bipartisan team, across the administrations. But, as the Bush people were leaving and as people like Tim Geithner were coming in, they powwowed a lot with the Chinese. You can read all about this in Adam Tooze's book. But China really stepped up. It passed the kinds of huge stimulus that the U.S. side was really pushing for. They weren't happy either that there was a certain group in the United States who was saying, well, the U.S. financial crisis is essentially China's fault. And, the logic was these, people who were kind of capital accounts determinists who said excessive Chinese savings and low consumption meant that money had to go somewhere. It was going to go to fuel, deficit spending by the United States, to heavy borrowing. The kind of caricature version of it is, if it weren't for all these Chinese savings, all these Wall Street, finance bros would never have come up with, mortgage-backed securities, and they never would have, had ninja loans and subprime lending, and then eventually, what were those things called? credit default swaps, right? They would have brought the whole house down.
Yeah.
It's just nonsense, of course.
Yeah. I don't I don't know that much about the economics of it, but it has always seemed funny to me that we'll complain that like China is keeping its currency too cheap or whatever. And the U.S. has always had a policy. I mean, you'll hear like we want to strengthen the dollar, we want to do this to the dollar, like. And as for the ratio of savings to consumption, you could say that we have the opposite problem, and it's
we sure do, yeah.
a much less responsible stance to persist over the years. But it's just like, I mean, if people started complaining about our dollar policy or something, I think we'd probably say it's really none of your business, right? But you do still hear that, and
right.
I mean, I guess I don't know. I'm not an economist. Uh, I guess it is one thing that deserves to be a subject of negotiation or something. I don't really know, but so the on the it seems to me that the Trump constituency. Well, wait a second. First, what year does Xi Jinping take over?
So he's 2012 or 2013. You could make the case for either. So he's named in October or November. I can't remember. Well, I think it was in October of 2012, but he actually takes the reins in March of 2013.
Mm-hmm. And is that shift, is that significant in the kind of perceived militancy and maybe actual militancy of China's stance toward the world and the U.S.? Does the thing shift at that point?
Well, you ask, is it perceived as such? It's certainly perceived as such. Whether it in fact was, I think, is another question entirely. I think that people ascribe too much to the fact that it's like, I think she was an inevitable thing. I mean, it was inevitable that the leader that followed the Hu and Wen years, 2003 to 2013, was going to be much more centralizing. He was going to, arrogate more authority to the party center, because the decade that had preceded him was widely perceived in China, which is where it really matters, as having been too collective, too decentralized. And it was deliberately decentralized and deliberately quite collective. We talk about it, we don't talk about it as the Hu Jintao era. We talk about it as the Hu and Wen era, which already suggests that there were at least two people. But there were very, very powerful people, in the Politburo Standing Committee, many of whom had quite strong sort of power bases outside of the party in different sectors of industry, in electric power, for example, or in the petroleum sector. And there were some very strong personalities. So this, I think, I think there's a good side to this and a bad side to this. I mean, those years you visited China, you said in 2010, and that was still during this time when things were very loosely governed. There was an awful lot of what we in the West would recognize as personal freedoms. There was, the internet was still sort of a wild west. It was a functional town square, a public sphere. But it was also a deeply corrupt time. It was a time when income inequality had gotten really, really terrible. It was a time when pollution had really gone extreme. And a couple of years later, we had air apocalypse where, PM 2.5 measurements were literally off the charts. I mean, I remember those years, not so fondly. So yeah, I mean, it was going to come. There was going to be a hardening. Whether it was Xi or anyone else, it would have been whether, if he had not won that power struggle and say Bo Xilai had emerged as leader, I have no doubt it would have been just as quote unquote authoritarian of a turn.
And also another thing that is probably to some extent structural is just that China, as a rising power, was going to feel its oats more and more and take a stronger stance toward the world and be less deferential to the other great power. I mean, this has happened pretty much throughout history, but I think that tends to be attributed to Xi, and tends to be, and Americans tend to think of it as something that kind of came out of the blue, as opposed to something that naturally happens when a truly rival power finally emerges.
Right. Yeah, I tend to take the same view. I don't buy into the sort of Carlylean great man business. Not so much. I think that it's mostly structural, and it was inevitable. I mean, if you sort of just look at a graph that would show just per capita GDP, that showed total GDP by purchasing power parity, if it showed some kind of measure of military wealth, all these other measures of flourishing, you saw that China was very much on the rise. And then, I think there's another piece of this, which is, of course, this sort of flagging American self-confidence again, that's brought on by, the great financial crisis.
And is to some extent manifest in Trump's victory. I would say there are various parts of the Trump coalition that point toward colder relations with China, certainly including the fact that, Trump's the part of Trump's base that was kind of Rust Belt workers who were wondering why their jobs weren't there anymore. One culprit was China, and it's true that some jobs had gone to China. So that all kind of made sense. I want to revisit briefly what we were just saying. You were saying it was probably to some extent inevitable that there would be a centralization of power within China, and I was saying it's probably to some extent inevitable that there would be a more, if not confrontational stance toward the U.S., a stance that would be perceived that way, and maybe was that way, a less deferential stance. And what's interesting to me is how often those two issues are conflated. In other words, the question of whether, let's say after 2000 or so, and the internet came, and the internet was going to exert this liberating effect, both in the realm of economics. It was going to lead to economic liberalism, political pluralism, and so on. There tended to be a conflation of the question of whether China would be A, authoritarian, and B, confrontational toward the U.S. In other words, between our view of its internal affairs and its external conduct. And this is also the way we view Russian affairs. When you ask some people what went wrong with Russian, U.S.-Russian affairs, they said, well, we thought Putin was headed toward democracy, but then blah, blah, blah. And I'm kind of like, well, wait, wasn't it possible in principle he could have not headed toward democracy, but been the head of a nation that was friendly with the U.S.? I mean, we have other, we're friendly with Saudi Arabia. We're friendly with Egypt. We're friendly with a lot of things. And I want to play you a quote. I hope this works. It's not very sophisticated technology, but it's from the Foreign Affairs podcast. No, the host, the editor of Foreign Affairs, is somebody you recently had on your podcast.
Yeah,
Dan,
yeah.
Is it
Kurtz Phelan? Yeah,
Kurtz Phelan. But the guest is Orville Schell.
Yeah.
You may have had him on your podcast.
I have. I know him well. Yeah, we've known each other forever. Yeah.
So the host asks him, was it a mistake to at least try engagement with China? Okay. And I want you to listen to what he says.
That's a really important question, and I think engagement was the right thing to try. If America is truly a great power, it should always try to peacefully resolve something, particularly when it's dealing with an autocratic state. And if there's any way under heaven for that state to slowly morph into something less antagonistic, maybe not completely democratic, but no democracy is perfect, that would be a great victory. And I think...
So, I mean, he's completely conflating the two issues. Did you catch that? He says...
I did, yeah.
He says, less antagonistic, maybe not completely democratic. And I just see these as two different dimensions. Look, I would love every country to be a liberal democracy. I like that about my country when it's working, which it's like not lately, but when it works, it's great. But still, there are plenty of times we have had nations that were not antagonistic to us, that were not democratic, that were not liberal democracies. I just think that's not an atypical way of the way he is thinking about it, which is to literally view them as one and the same issue. And of course, this is a great gripe, I'm sure, of China's, is that Why don't they quit? Why doesn't America quit complaining about how we run our country? We don't complain about how they run their country,
Right.
right?
Right.
That's got to be the view there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's this really kind of baked in normative preference, obviously, for liberal democratic systems, because, and, I think even deeper than that, we refuse to recognize regimes that are not, at some level, we refuse to recognize regimes that are not put in power by procedural democracy as even legitimate, as even possessing rudimentary legitimacy. So I think that's part of the really kind of deep problem that we have with China. It's interesting because a recent study that came out by Rand of all places, one of their sort of top line recommendations is that we explicitly recognize the legitimacy of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China. That's needed to stabilize the U.S.-China rivalry. I mean, it even that somehow provoked a lot of people, even just the recognition of legitimacy. Because I think there are still a lot of people, and maybe even some people who are listening, who would say, no, you cannot possibly possess legitimacy except through the ballot box,
Right.
except as an expression of popular will. I don't believe that. Yeah.
Whereas it seems to me an important question, if not the most important question in that realm is, well, do their people consider them legitimate? Because
Right.
that's the thing we have to reckon with. I mean, if they do, then that's important,
Yeah.
And right now, I guess you would say that the Chinese people are, well, happier with Xi Jinping than the American people are with Donald Trump. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. Obviously, look, when you make an assertion like that, they'll say, based on what? I mean,
Right.
they will assume that any kind of public opinion polling that's done suffers from, falsification of preference, right? Preference falsification, that there's this kind of implicit belief when, the skeptical American, and I guess I understand where it comes from, that anyone who says otherwise, other than, of course I approve, is going to be immediately shipped off to do hard labor in a gulag. That's not the case, of course. And, I think clever social scientists are able to design research that can actually account for levels of preference falsification. And when they do, and even when they when that plays out, you still find very, very high levels of regime support in China, of genuine optimism, of a belief that the Chinese system is essentially fair. It drives a lot of people crazy to hear that, but them's the facts.
Okay, so as I said, Trump's constituency, in some ways, it just made political sense for him to demonize China, which he did. And then, of course, the COVID thing is a perfect opportunity for him to double down on that, and he does. And there are other maybe political reasons. China hawkism was working for him then, and then Biden comes in, and it wasn't obvious to me that you would expect a Democratic administration to basically sustain the attitude, but I think it did partly because for whatever reason, it framed world affairs as an existential struggle between democracy and autocracy. That became its frame, and maybe that was related to him having run his campaign on the theme of opposition to
fascism.
Trump the autocrat, Trump the authoritarian aspiring autocrat. Maybe that's a reason, but it seems to me during Biden, the China hawk consensus was really consolidated. What would you say about why you think? And if you think I'm right that Biden was pretty hawkish toward China, and if so, how that manifested itself, and if not, why not? And in any event, what were the roots of that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it, is that, that binary framing of democracy versus autocracy was already present in the campaign. I think that the people he brought in in his foreign policy team, a lot of them were, real true believers. And I think in addition to that, there's that thing that somehow sticks in the American craw when you look at China. There were so many ways in which China's rise had really kind of knocked out basically these pillars of American exceptionalism, these nearly axiomatic beliefs that we've had about ourselves and our democracy. The intimate tie between free market economics and political democracy that we've believed in for so long.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first thing. China was clearly the bumblebee that's not supposed to fly and yet does, right? I mean, we never believed that it was possible to have a functioning market economy unless you had also sort of political democracy. We've long believed that. I mean, we don't articulate it, but it's definitely present. And then there were the other things that we talked a little bit about that belief in technology as inherently emancipatory. By the time Biden took office in 2017, it was already clear that technologies, including social media, could be used to very much subvert democracy. That rather than this liberating force, it was kind of the trusty handmaiden of authoritarianism. We had already kind of let go of this idea that it was impossible to innovate, to have technological innovation under political autocracy. And even though we should have been aware of earlier historical examples where there was tech innovation under the most autocratic regimes that we've ever seen, we went on believing that about China for a long time, and then of course until we didn't. And so I think that there were these China kept taking a sledgehammer to these pillars of American exceptionalism, and it kind of threw us into this self-doubt, into this period of self-doubt. And when we double down on the moral element of it, and so we have to believe that we are an exceptionally moral actor in the world, and that leads us to the sort of to really embrace the ideological plank, to do the sorts of things the Biden administration did, and cast China as like this singularly evil autocratic bad guy in the world.
And of course, China was in some respects being more assertive. In some ways, you might have predicted, like, the idea that a rising power is going to increasingly think of itself as having a sphere of influence that it gets to dominate. And so you had these, contestation over, barrier reefs, island chains, and so on. There was more assertiveness there. And then there were things that I think in retrospect, even China would say were a mistake, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where for a while, representatives of the, Chinese officials thought it was their mission to kind of act like assholes on social media. And that they've kind of pulled back on. That's not happening so much. But this was all, this was part of the mix. And I don't know what else you'd mention on either side.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to say. But yeah, you've put your finger on some of it for sure. Look, I mean, yeah, part of it is it should maybe come as less as a surprise to us that a great power would be acting like a great power. That's what they do. They throw their weight around. They develop this peculiar insensitivity to the needs of lesser powers. Who was it? Luwak called it great power autism. That's not a polite word these days, but
that gets back to the cognitive empathy issue.
Right.
Because,
they lack cognitive empathy suddenly.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there is people on the spectrum are more likely to have what they call it technically is theory of mind deficit, but they're less able to easily read the room. Sometimes there is a statistical correlation. And this is a well-known thing that powerful, there's a fascinating cognitive empathy experiment that I'll tell you about it in overtime, because I want to get I want to get your take on what you see as the signs that China hawkism is, if not in retreat, at least no longer advancing and maybe waning a bit.
Yeah, so I don't want to call it in retreat because, as I think I do want to make sure to say later on, I think that so many of the root causes of China hawkery, they themselves are not likely to go away. So it's remission or eclipse, I think, and the moon comes back out from behind the sun, right? Or the other way around, rather, the sun comes back out from behind the moon during an eclipse. And I think it will, in this case, China Shock 2.0 is right around the corner. But no, I think that the reasons are numerous. First of all, look, we can't deny it. It's always a comparative act, right? And so they look domestically at the shit show that is American politics, and it's hard not to begin to grudgingly admire China. But there were a lot of things that happened since the beginning of this year. I mean, one of them is obviously the DeepSeek sort of Sputnik moment, right? That really helped put the nail in this coffin of this idea that China was incapable of innovation, that it was just imitation. And even the people who said no, they're just refining output from American, or they're doing it on stolen American chips. That started to sound more desperately like cope, right? I mean, to I think anyone's ears. And then there's another really weird little episode, and I'm sure you remember this, but in the waning days of the Biden administration, when it looked like just on his way out, he would actually pull the plug on TikTok. A lot of the so-called TikTok refugees just sort of is this kind of act of irony, a trolling thing. They said, well, you don't want us to be on this Chinese platform. We're all going to pile onto a real Chinese platform, one where the interface isn't even in English. It's entirely in Chinese. But here we are, and they all show up on Red Note. And there were a couple 100,000 of them that migrated to this platform called Xiaohongshu or Red Note. And there, they saw, they were warmly greeted. First of all, the Chinese people, a lot of my friends were like, oh, all these Americans have suddenly shown up, and it's kind of fun. Let's show them what our lives are like. And, the demographic that uses this is a little bit like, Etsy or Pinterest, right? These are like pretty bougie people living pretty swank lives in China's nicer cities. So these are, women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s in Hangzhou or in Shanghai, and they live well, and they're very eager to show people how well they actually do live. And so there's a lot of infrastructure porn and food porn and apartment porn and they treat them extremely nicely. So that went well beyond just the few people who were actually there on the site, but it metastasized. It was all over Twitter and on Instagram. So it became a real phenomenon. I think that there was this collective sense among a lot of these Gen Z and younger millennial people that they had been gaslit on China. They had been told, they'd been given this narrative on China, and they were very eager to sort of do their own research and find out and for themselves what China is really like. And China wasn't stupid about it. They recognized this as an opportunity, and they started bringing over a lot of these really big influencers. They would give them these these pretty lavish VIP tours around China, where they would see the LED festooned buildings and the drone swarms and all the fancy infrastructure and the breathtaking bridges, and of course they would ride the high speed rail system, and they would ooh and ah and reinforce this idea that the American mainstream media had gaslit the American public on China. So I think that's a lot of it. And, that trickles up in a democracy. I mean, I think they start to realize, look, China hawkery isn't selling so well now with this constituency.
Yeah. The basic idea that the more kind of disorder and incompetence you see in our American government, the less bad, an authoritarian but at least competent government looks. I think that is part of it. But is it, broadly speaking, is the idea kind of, well, if you can't beat them, join them? In other words, it isn't just that it's an orderly society. It's it's productive, it's innovative. The Tom Friedman columns. A number of people have gone to these factories and said, "Look, folks, these guys are for real. They do innovate. They're ahead of us in certain economically important areas, and we better take this seriously." I mean, I can imagine that being, a China hawk, integrating that into their talking points. They're even scarier than we thought they were. We have to double down.
Sure.
But you're saying it's more of a, if you can't beat them, join them reaction, or what?
Yeah, I wouldn't go quite that far, but it certainly, hey, me beating on them is not resonating anymore for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Just politically in America, you mean? It's not
I mean, that's what it's always going to be. I mean, that is always the reference point, right? I mean, they're not going to do it because they've had this epistemic realization that maybe things are different. But I think that there is a kind of reckoning that's happening more broadly in American society. It's starting to happen, and where there's accretion of facts, just the evidence of our eyes, just looking at China. But of course, I think nothing. I mean, I can't believe I haven't even brought this up yet. But we had all these major taco events this year.
Trump always chickens out.
Yeah, so Trump has chickened out now with China 3 times in very conspicuous ways, where the Trump administration has levied huge tariffs, where China has retaliated, has not backed down, has shown some spine, and Trump has been forced to back down now on 3 different occasions. This last one at Busan was the biggest one because China, I mean, I think a lot of people are now starting to write this, and we will look back at that moment in 2025 as the moment when we could weaponized interdependence was no longer a weapon that only the United States had, at its disposal. The interdependence part of it became very operational. And so, China, by implementing these rare earths export controls, scared the bejesus out of the Trump administration, and and the Europeans, by the way, who backed down over the Nexperia incident, in which they had undertaken at the United States' behest. So we're living in a very different world right now, where you can't shove China around, and I think the hawks realize that a lot of what they're bellowing and shaking of their fists rings increasingly hollow to their constituents.
Mm-hmm. For me, it often gets back to cognitive empathy, but you might think that back when we were starting to pull out the big guns in terms of tech leverage, and I'd say the big gun was pulled out by the Biden administration with their version of chip controls, although during the first Trump administration, there had been some tech restrictions on Chinese imports, but Biden went big, I would say. And you might think they would have said, okay, suppose you're China and somebody does this to you. What do you do? And you might then say, well, what levers do you have? And you might then say rare earth minerals. And then you might say, I'm not sure we want to get into this game. And that is where it kind of predictably led. I mean, to be honest, they waited longer than I would have guessed. I mean, Trump, it was what they did with the rare earths this time was a response to, this is still not widely understood, I think, the extent to which it was a reaction to this particular thing Trump did about
the affiliate rule. It's called the affiliate rule. And it wasn't even clear that it was done with Trump's knowledge or his consent.
Right. Now, I wrote about this in the newsletter, but in any event, it would have burdened a lot of Chinese companies, and it was, broadly speaking, part of the tech restriction thing. And that finally pushed them over the edge. But to my mind, it's like, of course, it is a very interdependent world. That means we both have levers if we want to use them. And eventually they were going to use theirs. And now we recognize that. Of course, this combines with their manifestly growing economic strength to make us reckon with them. But yeah.
And their military might. We can't ignore that either. I mean, on September 3rd, the world got to watch that parade. It was, if you think about, again, a study in contrast, if we think back to the July 4th parade in D.C.
The Trump parade, where these like slouching soldiers with their, with their
just sort of shuffling along,
not quite with their shirt tails untucked, but close.
Yeah.
Okay, so listen, Kaiser, as you know, I generally, with this podcast, we do about 45 minutes or so or more in public. Then we go into overtime. Paid subscribers to the Non-Zero newsletter can follow us into overtime. And you've been kind enough to stick around. We're going to talk about a number of things. There is this fascinating cognitive empathy experiment, which shows that powerful people indeed pay less attention to what's going on in the minds of the less powerful. I mean, individual people. I want to talk about, ask you about a common grievance you hear from Americans. Of course, the American view is this is everything that's bad is, both sides tend to blame the other. And this is just a particular dimension of that I want to ask you about. And then I want to flesh out what you see as the signs of the eclipsing of the China hawk attitude. Where's that showing up in journal articles or wherever it's showing up? Speaking of which, I know you just had an article. It's called The Great Reckoning. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right.
And people should Google that. I sadly have not read it, but why don't you give us the 30-second thesis before we go into overtime? Maybe we'll have time to explore it further in overtime.
Yeah, sure. So it's in the Ideas Letter. So theideasletter.org. The piece is called The Great Reckoning. I think they gave it a subtitle that wasn't part of my original title. It's something like What the United States Should Learn from China. It doesn't actually, in fact, call for the United States to learn from China, but it's not, neither is it like a set of prescriptions for what the United States should do to keep its lead on China or anything like that. But instead, it's just basically a call on Americans to get psychologically comfortable with the fact, to come to terms with the fact. And there's one sort of metaphor that I use in the middle of it, which is it's sort of like the way we think about climate change. Mm-hmm. We've had this accretion of evidence. We all know about what's happening in global warming. We see these, once in a century storms now happening every couple of years. We see, these gigantic wildfires across the American West and in Australia. We know all of this stuff. We know that the intensity of storms every fall, is much greater because of the carrying capacity. We know about ocean acidification and threats to biodiversity and all this stuff. But somehow we don't act like we know this. Mm-hmm. Somehow, even though we can all recite the statistics about, how much we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees C, we just still do not behave as though that's reality for us. I think unless we're Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, we don't. And so it's sort of like China. It's one of these enormous things. I don't mean to catastrophize China. China is not like global warming. It's not bad, but it is a huge fact that should be very, very clear to us now. But we are still, very much in denial. We deny. We smoke a lot of copium as in response to this. We do this thing where we recite this litany of Chinese perfidy before we can say anything remotely positive about China, just to remind ourselves that we are still sort of, the ones with God on our side. We're the ones with the moral high ground, right?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna talk a little about moral high ground on the other side when we get into overtime. But so people again should check out the Sinica Podcast, Sinica, and newsletter. And if you have time, read the essay Kaiser just described. And again, if you go to the Non-Zero newsletter and become a paid subscriber, you can set up a podcast feed that'll always give you the overtime segments. And we'll also have a post devoted to this particular podcast where you can watch or listen to the overtime. Thanks for sticking with us this far, whether or not you're following us into overtime. And here we go into overtime.